Thank you, Caroline, for meeting with me today to discuss change leadership, managing change remotely, and what that means for the leadership team. So for everybody listening to this interview, this is Caroline Samne. She's with the Pillars in Montreal, and she's in change management and specializes more on the leadership component of transformations. So welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I think everybody's well aware, Caroline, that there's been a lot of changes in the last 6 months due to the pandemic. And so I've been speaking to different people from different fields to understand the impacts, more specifically from an organizational change perspective. And so I wanted to talk to you today to get a bit of your input with the leaders that you work with. How has the pandemic changed the way they manage and lead change remotely or within their organizations?
Good question. Big question. So, of course, yes, the fact that we've had to move to virtual realities and to managing through the computer and any other platform that we're using today has changed dynamics from my conversations and the work I've been doing in the last months, especially, where leaders are noticing things that are changing in terms of their own leadership style, in the sense of having to be more aware of how they show up. Because
so when they show up, how does that, so they can't go to town hall anymore, so how do they change that?
Yeah, so a lot of people have said to me that they feel it's actually become more personal. When you're in a room with people, it's easy to have sidebar conversations. It's easy to be a little bit maybe unfocused. Whereas now, they feel like they really have to pay attention and they really have to choose their words, and that they're paying attention to more about how people are feeling, which was not a natural thing for a lot of leaders before. They were getting right into content, right into work, right into objectives. And that was okay with them. They felt it was normal. As much as we've talked about emotions in the workplace for many years, and we've been asking leaders to embrace that part of leadership and who they are and who people are, it's been a struggle. And from one day to the next, all of a sudden, here we are in a situation that's been, I think the word for me that keeps coming up is it's very emotional, in the form that not only is it stressful, because a lot of unknowns, because, you know, work has shifted, business models have shifted. So now leaders who before were not wanting to embrace emotions find themselves thrown into a situation where you almost look like you're some kind of insensitive person just jumping into content. So leaders have said to me, I feel like now I really have to start my meetings differently. I have to close them differently, and I have to pay attention to things I didn't necessarily pay attention to before. And that's more on the emotional side.
So what is one of the biggest things that they've changed now in the way they approach their employees and their peers in the organization?
One of the things I'm hearing a lot is actually asking the question, how are you? And actually listening for a response. You know, how are you tends to be a very rhetorical question we ask, but we don't really care to hear the answer, or we just want to hear I'm fine. And that even that word or that question has had new meaning and has brought people to a different level of conversation, because people seemingly now are okay to actually tell someone, their leaders, I'm not okay. I'm struggling. And leaders on the flip side often are telling me, and I actually don't know what to do with that. So it's changing dynamics.
So what do you think we can do to help the leaders? Because I think we can see it. I mean, we're already here in October, and we just started October, and we can see that it's not going to end at the end of this month. It's going to stay here for a while longer. So what can we start recommending to leaders in
Right.
order to support them a little better and help them out proactively, that they feel a bit more comfortable to, because they're kind of forced onto this path and they're going to have to stay on this path. So what can we do to better support them?
So what we're encouraging to leaders around this whole situation is for them to stop and pause. A lot of people just wanted to push on the accelerator and say, okay, now that we're virtual, we've got to get more work done. We've got to make sure productivity doesn't go down. But the reality is you can't actually accelerate the speed of things. You have to somewhat slow it down. And that is a bit unnatural for some leaders because, they're expecting certain things. We've talked a lot about self-awareness as leaders. How is this affecting you? You can't be in support of other people if you don't stop and reflect upon how is this impacting you? You're a human, you have a life, you have a family. And for some leaders, that's very natural and easy. And for other leaders, that becomes more of an exercise. So we often are coaching leaders through some self-directed reflections for them to come back and really tap in. And it's a big component of emotional intelligence. How are you feeling? And that's been something we're advocating a lot. Some leaders, like I said, do it more naturally, have an easier time. Others are struggling, and it doesn't come naturally for them to, introspect and look at their own emotions, let alone ask anybody else how they're feeling.
Yes. And do you think that they're still communicating in the same way? Do you think they're still, doing everything in writing, or do you feel that maybe they should start looking at other options, like maybe sending short video clips with specific messages to their staff? Yeah. Again, to sort of bridge a little bit of the distances that we have now with the remote working.
So for sure, I mean, if nowadays we need more the visual, so the CEO, leader, whoever, absolutely should be using, whether it's video or podcast or, some kind of live voice. So it's not just an email, which email nowadays, anyways, it's been a while. I would say email is not the most favored method. Most people are drowning in email. So I think, creativity has to come. I've seen messaging going through Slack channels recently too, where people are using that as a method of communication rather than large means, putting it on the company portal. It'll be uploaded to each team's Slack channel.
Yeah, and I've seen the same thing with Microsoft Teams, where they have what they call a company communicator, and you can just send, push us a chat message to everybody in the organization, and It pops up in their activity feed, which is so much easier to read, and it's much more succinct and concise than an actual email.
Yeah, agreed.
Which we didn't see 6 months or 9 months ago.
100%. I was on a session recently where the leader hadn't asked me anything, and actually Slack was being used as a means to gather questions. So even that, I had not seen that even early this year. It's the first time that was used as a mechanism for gathering questions from the team, from the company.
Yeah, and that makes sense. But from a program perspective, transformation programs, transformation projects, are you seeing any difference at the leadership level in terms of what they're pursuing versus not? When we started COVID-19, everybody kind of put everything to a halt, thinking that it was a temporary halt, and everybody kind of went to hibernation. Some have come out of that hibernation and started getting the ball rolling again. Full throttle. Others have kind of decided, okay, we're going to move these forward, keep these on the side for now. But there are still leaders that are just withholding and still in hibernation today, thinking this is going to blow over and then we'll go back full steam.
Yeah. So I've seen what you've seen, a little bit of everything, but something that's really been notable that I've been interested and trying to sort of understand a little bit more, and I'll give you my context on it. There's been a switch from what we call smaller tactical changes, meaning like we might change a process or we might change a system or a technology, to some conversations that are more I'm going to call them systemic. And, COVID's been one thing that's shaken up our world, but then you've had a lot of other issues that have been hitting the landscape, around Black Lives Matter, systemic racism, and all the rest of it. And so interesting conversations are happening in organizations where they're saying, okay, so some of the programs we were running were maybe at a very micro level, and maybe we need to start thinking about some of the larger systemic changes that need to happen in this organization. And I've seen in the last actually 2 months, some rechanneling of money into what I'm calling larger systemic changes, because the issues that were playing out became very important for the organization. And then upon doing an analysis, a recognition that a lot of things were broken in their own system. And then so money needed to be put in to look at it. And obviously it's not just money, but at one point, if you want to make some major changes, you do have to put some resources into that program or that transformation project. So yes, I've seen, to your point, some are still halted. Some are thinking when 2021 hits, we'll rethink our investments. Others I've seen actually very proactively say, this is the time to look at reshifting our business.
Definitely. And not just externally, but even internally. This is such a great opportunity. Many things that we thought would not be able to sustain, like remote working. How many organizations were completely against remote working?
100%.
Able to track what's actually being done. And I mean, we can see that it's working for most organizations. It's working very well.
100%.
So this is a great opportunity to continue on this path and try to look at other areas where initially we thought that there was no opportunities to change and to start thinking differently, and even I would think get feedback from the staff, from those people, because they probably have really good insight onto some of these changes that can become more permanent and can be enhanced so they can, we can sustain them longer term.
And to that point about change coming from different points, I think that is something that to me is very exciting. For a very long time, there's a paradigm that we lived with in change, and that was that change has to come from the top and it has to trickle down, and we have to sell the change, and very sort of rigid almost kind of modeling. Now, because we've had to de facto become more agile. We've had to somehow trust that things were going to happen. We also are hearing that people are coming to the table to say, you know what, that thing we were doing for 10 years, no one's done it for 6 months and nobody misses it. So therefore, we need to rethink that whole piece of work or that whole piece of whatever. And I'm seeing an openness from leaders who are embracing this, and I'm not sure why. Is it because now everyone is in such a position of saying we need to reinvent? Reinvention's a word now you're hearing and seeing everywhere. So maybe now there is an openness because it's a bit of a survival mentality in some people's minds. So change is now being instigated. I'm seeing it from all parts of an organization, and there's an openness. I just got off a call a little before our interview where the director actually said to his team, anything and everything's possible. Like, you guys need to come to me and tell me what you're noticing. So there was a great invitation to make change happen.
Well, because we're no longer in this complacency and this model where we kind of, you get up, you go to work, spend your day in the office, you go home, and then you kind of rinse and repeat. We're in a completely different different time, and it's changed our mindsets. And so I think, as to your point, that's why it's no longer just a top-down approach to changes. I think it's coming from every direction, and especially, I think, from bottom up. A lot of the staff are living it, so they have really good insight. And if the leaders are willing to listen, I think this is a perfect time for change. This change, I think, is what's going to, encourage us to do even bigger changes more bolder changes that before we wouldn't do because, we were in a complacent place.
Yeah. Well, there was always this thing we would hear, and Natalie, you probably heard it as much as I do, is, well, if it's not broken, don't change it, right? And how long did we live with that adage? And now, well, everything's broken. So guess what? If you really believe that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, well, now it's broke. So, there is that opportunity to your point. I think if we miss the opportunity, it's a shame, shame on us. And that a lot of what was happening before was already, in my mind, broken anyhow. But it didn't appear broken.
No, I agree.
Many,
never go back to exactly the way things were because we're experiencing these changes. I don't think everybody's just going to one day just close their eyes and pretend like this didn't happen and try to go back. Some organizations might.
Some might, yeah.
But generally speaking, I think our experiences are changing and we will carry those experiences, which by default change our mindsets. And if, different experience, different mindset, you can't have the same outcome. So I think that wherever we're going, changes is happening. It's for sure. It's a sure thing that's going to happen. How things are going to change, I think that's where we don't know because different organizations are at different levels in that path.
Yes. And where leadership to me still really matters is the more mature, and when I say mature, I use that word in the sense of participative leadership, where you had already leaders who believed in the servant mindset, who believed in, human practices. Those organizations, my sense is, are going to adapt faster because creativity will come from everywhere and it'll be accepted. And whatever change needs to happen is going to be one of those sort of just natural processes versus organizations that were embedded in very hierarchical leadership, centralized in one spot. It's too slow. If decision making is not decentralized, you can't move fast.
But I think that's exactly what we're living, decentralized decision making.
Yeah, well, it has to be. And that's what you're saying, the organizations that haven't adopted a little bit of that mentality, I'm not sure how they're going to survive COVID, to tell you very honestly, because right now, if you need to wait for one person or two people to make a decision in a world that is, never mind COVID, we're in I don't know if you've heard the term VUCA.
Yes.
But it's VUCA world. COVID just exposed how much of a VUCA world it is. But if it's not COVID, it's going to be a lot of other things. Volatility is going to be all around us. So if we keep organizations stuck in rigid old models of decision-making leadership, I don't know how that evolves into whatever. Maybe it's not COVID, it'll be something else that's going to hit us.
So that's the thing is we know, I even know personally of organizations that have gone back to the old way. They've asked their staff, mandated their staff to go back into the office, go back to exactly the way they were. And so I guess my question to you would be, what would be the recommendations you would make on how we could reach those leaders to first open up their eyes to the reality of what's going on and that there is a different way of sustaining the organization by not ignoring what we're in right now and then trying to stay in the old ways? What would be the recommendations to provide them that help, that support, so we could sort of lead them into a completely different path and they would feel like they have what they need, they're well equipped with the resources needed to be able to venture into that different direction.
Right. So mindset is a really hard thing to shift, and it's unfortunately probably more difficult than a lot of skill building and all the rest of it. And this is where, when we're talking about helping leaders to shift a mindset, we start with asking the question of what would be their motivation to change, right? And sometimes there's triggers in an organization that lead people to say, I may not like it, but I know I have no choice. And for example, you might see some organizations that have high turnover, or they're having trouble recruiting, right? So they've got positions that are open for too long. They could be critical positions, and that's costing them at some level, at many levels. So there's different triggers within an organization that sometimes force leaders to have to take a look to see what's going on. And depending on how the organization is structured, that's the role sometimes of internal people. If they're lucky enough to have an internal OD or HR or whatnot, people have to help surface some of this data, because if leaders aren't seeing it, then there's a problem. How is it that a leader is not seeing that their organization is suffering at some level? Our data speaks, but often it's not visible. We look at sometimes with organizations, we'll ask them, how long is your recruiting cycle and how much does it cost you? And if they don't know those numbers, and if you're not an attractive employer, for example, and I mentioned, sometimes we talk to someone who'll say, I've had this role open for 2 years. Okay, well, unless you're looking for a needle in the haystack, why in God's name do you have a role open for 2 years? Start looking around and, just start going on Glassdoor, go on social media. What's your reputation? It doesn't often take us long to see that, oh my God, if you go out into the world and ask people, what do you think of company XYZ? And people will say, don't go near them, don't touch them. So as a CEO, as a leader, as a whoever, if that doesn't signal you that something is wrong in the organization, then you have your head in the sand. So at that point, you may not want to recognize that it's a leadership issue. But we ask people to start digging a little bit. Now, often if they're lucky enough, they may agree to work with a coach who will help them understand that not everything is external to them, because sometimes it's easy to point, oh, it's the market, it's the industry, it's my HR team, it's whoever, but they don't want to point inwards. So sometimes we'll suggest work with a coach. A coach will help you to sort of understand the issues. Go get data. Go ask yourself, how is my organization really doing? What are the metrics I should be looking at? Not just your bottom line or not just your top line or and things like that. But that's often a trigger for companies, right? They wait until they're losing money or they're losing market share
before they decide that something's wrong. So I guess awareness is the first thing.
Awareness. Yeah.
And then from there, once they're aware of what's going on, what's not working, what could work better, opportunities, and then you could probably work from there with them.
Right. And like I say, if they're open to coaching, that's always very helpful, because a good coach will also help you hold up a mirror, right? And won't let you get away with just pointing fingers to external factors. But, sometimes you need to own something. If you're having a hard time with retention, you can't just blame it on your hiring practices or whatever. There might be there's a problem in the culture possibly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Caroline, thank you so much for your time. I think we just have a few minutes left. Any parting words for leaders out there listening to us today?
I would suggest for leaders to come to the realization that sometimes change is not just an external factor, it's also an inside job. So we have to take a look both inside and outside.
And I think your dog Cooper agrees with you, it seems. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Caroline, for your time today.
It's
and thank
been
you
a pleasure
for watching.
Thanks, Natalie. It was a pleasure chatting.